28 Days Later became a classic horror movie after its release in 2002 and has only gotten bigger over the following decades, but a harsh truth about the film exposes a major issue with the consumption of modern movies and TV shows. Despite having a very small budget, 28 Days Later managed to become a smash hit, both critically and financially, resulting in it eventually launching a sequel in 2007. Although it didn't quite measure up to the original, the project was still a success and continued the franchise's legacy, leading to the confirmation of 28 Years Later. With the movie series finding a modern resurgence, interest in the project that started it all has naturally picked up, leading to many fans and new viewers wanting to give it a watch. Unfortunately, 28 Days Later isn't on streaming, and even finding a physical copy is relatively difficult, making it a challenge for audiences to actually revisit the cult classic. Given how many movies and TV shows are at our fingertips these days, it almost feels bizarre being unable to watch Danny Boyle's thriller without complications, which highlights one of the biggest problems with how modern entertainment is consumed. Why 28 Days Later isn't available on streaming? Rights issues with the movie mean it hasn't found a home on streaming. Not having one of the most innovative horror films from the early 2000s on streaming seems strange, but there is a reason behind its absence. According to Rolling Stone, the reason for 28 Days Later not being available online comes down to rights issues, which have resulted in the only legal way to watch the movie being through physical media. With the film being produced and distributed by Fox Searchlight Pictures, who are now owned by Disney, it would seem probable for 28 Days Later to end up on Hulu like its sequel. However, Sony own the rights. Sony was able to win the bidding war for 28 Years Later and also picked up 28 Days Later, creating complications since Disney bought the studio that initially produced it. As a result, the original discs are the only official way to watch the movie, and they are pretty rare to find, resulting in high second-hand prices. While it isn't out of the question for Sony to eventually put it on a streaming platform, 28 Days Later's unconventional zombie premise remains a relatively niche viewing experience these days that only few can legally enjoy, adding to the film's one-of-a-kind nature. Streaming is a super convenient, but inherently flawed, means of looking for films. Platforms opting not to host certain films goes against what makes streaming so appealing. Cillian Murphy in front of the 28 Days Later zombie eyes. Custom image by Milika Djordjevic. While streaming is an undeniably convenient way of consuming modern entertainment, it's also a flawed system, as 28 Days Later proves. Being able to sign up for a monthly subscription service and have a plethora of shows and films at your disposal is great, especially when watching selectively. A new series may drop on streaming, and once it has been watched, viewers can cancel until something new comes around. Regrettably, this does have its drawbacks, as platforms can be strategical about what they choose to show, often to the viewer's detriment. Although streamers are unlikely to avoid platforming popular IPs, they may opt to drop some from their service if they aren't gaining much traction. Therefore, viewers who haven't gotten around to something are at risk of losing out on a show or movie they were interested in simply because they weren't fast enough. With certain platforms having exclusive rights to specific franchises, this creates even more problems, as there may be no other streaming service that has the show or movie a fan is looking for, resulting in them ending up in a similar position to 28 Days Later. Removing projects can be financially beneficial for platforms, and with Disney Plus' recent subscription cost increase following in the footsteps of other streamers, it's clear users aren't always the priority. Sadly, the ability to remove certain shows or films when it is beneficial undercuts the overall appeal of the streaming format, proving that there is a huge problem with the current consumption of media. Will 28 Days Later be legally available ahead of 28 Years Later? Rumors have suggested the film will be released on digital before the franchise's next installment. Aaron Taylor Johnson in 28 Years Later and Cillian Murphy as Jim in 28 Days Later. Custom image by Dhruv Sharma. There has been no official confirmation that 28 Days Later will have a digital release ahead of the new movie, but it does appear likely. Alongside rumors emerging that there is a digital version on the way, Sony has also started a sign-up page to notify fans about its availability to pre-order. The page indicates that a new legal method of watching the film will be possible at some point, and while it may not be via streaming directly, it could be available for purchase on the likes of Amazon or Apple in the future. With Cillian Murphy returning for 28 Years Later, it seems like the newest installment will tie into the original, making it important that new viewers get a chance to watch the 2002 hit. The project might not be essential viewing, but understanding the previous films will make the upcoming sequel even better, hence the demand for a digital option. Even if physical versions of the movie don't return to circulation, fans will at least have a legal way of watching the horror if the rumors are true, adding an exciting new chapter to the franchise's legacy. 28 Years Later won't face the problem that haunts 28 Days Later. 28 years later will inevitably end up on a streaming platform at some point. Unlike 28 Days Later, the franchise's upcoming movie shouldn't face any difficulties surrounding its streaming future. Although Sony doesn't have a traditional streaming service equivalent to the likes of Netflix or Prime Video, the studio has seldom struggled with getting its projects on these platforms. In fact, not having a direct service is arguably more beneficial, as Sony can sell their films and shows to the highest bidder, and 28 years later will be no exception. Once its theatrical run has ended, it will likely end up on digital and Blu-ray, before eventually finding a home online. When 28 Days Later was first released, streaming services were incredibly uncommon, hence it being unavailable over 2 decades later. In contrast, 28 Years Later will drop in a mainstream era for streaming, meaning it is unlikely to face the same problems as the franchise's original film. Unless Sony decides to keep it away from streaming, it will inevitably appear somewhere by the end of 2025, or at the latest 2026, and even if it does somehow run into the same issue as 28 Days Later, it won't be for the same reason and should still get a digital release.